This is Monitoring for Varroa Mites. Thank you for watching. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, I'm going to open with a bit of a primer on what to expect for this presentation. We will build the case for monitoring thresholds. A moment will be given to talk about monitoring methods, and we will overview and go through a step-by-step instruction for how to perform an alcohol wash. We will finish with interpreting results and end with a resource for you to learn even more about the all-important process of tracking Varroa mites in your hive. Lesson 27 built on the case for proactive early monitoring of Varroa mites. This presentation is a follow-on to that lesson in that it reinforces why we are monitoring. Some background on monitoring options, a recommendation and instructions for the industry standard monitoring practice that we recommend, with a pinch of rationale as to why to proceed that way. In the previous lesson, we built a case for understanding how an overabundance of mites damages a colony. If we go back to the early days of Varroa mites in America, we can recognize that someone had to come up, develop a system for gauging how mites harm a colony, and then subsequently devise a way to assess when too many mites would lead to problems. Fast forward to today, and we recognize that the thresholds settled upon do not always pan out as an exact science due to a number of factors that could influence outcomes. But giving credit where credit is due, the established process for sampling for Varroa mites is a well-established process and the norm in the industry. On the whole, monitoring has proven most beneficial as a practice, even with some misfires in execution here and there. One thing that becomes clear: if you are above the thresholds, then you carry a lot of risk. Visually, a compromised honeybee colony can look perfectly fine. It could have a full complement of bees and normal activities going on. But like when a flu epidemic hits, the detrimental impacts of a colony overwhelmed by mites can turn the tide in rapid fashion. A seemingly healthy colony can have a large complement of compromised bees just at the time that the bees are going into winter, and the impacts are pervasive enough that the entire colony does not make it to spring. In a superorganism structure, the bees need the entire colony to work together to maintain the colony's welfare and especially to survive winter. If a contingent of the population is compromised, the colony will not make it through. In short, to not be abreast of how many mites are in your population of bees is to be uninformed. As an aside, it is rather uncommon for mite impacts to show up in a new colony, especially new ones that were started this year. Typically, you will not see something like the advanced conditions shown here on the slide in a year one colony, especially if you started with bees that were well cared for before they got to you. The most important way to know of impending problems is to monitor your new colony. This brings us to ways to monitor. Over the decades of beekeepers dealing with Varroa mites, a number of ways to check on mites were devised. One of the more popular methods adapted was to count Varroa mites on a sticky board. You would slide this tray underneath your hive, and it was covered with some sort of surface so that if a mite fell on it, it could not get away. One of the more popular mediums is Vaseline. You would use it in one of two ways. Just general observation. When you're doing a hive inspection, pull the tray out, look to see how many Varroa mites are on it, and by that you could gauge the mite load and decide whether you're going to treat. Over time, this just became, one, ineffective by the labor it took to count the mites, and two, unreliable in a full-blown, this is how I'm going to know how many mites are in my hive. It just wasn't reliable enough. The second method, though, is actually an effective technique, more like a utility. Typically, beekeepers will treat their hive, and when the mites die, they fall down through the bottom and they collect on the sticky board. After treatment, for a sense of how many mites were in the hive, you could pull the sticky board out and see, is it a minor drop or is it absolutely loaded with Varroa mites? This practice is still something that a lot of beekeepers do today, but as a whole, there's a superior method than sticky boards for checking on mites. Cutting to the chase and foregoing delving down a history lesson on mite monitoring, beekeepers landed on the main recommended method in the industry. It's called the alcohol wash. It's a specific routine devised that is fairly easy to conduct, repeatable, and consistent across the industry, and it provides an accepted metric indicator for deciding whether to treat the colony. The premise of the technique is to collect a sample of bees and dislodge the mites from their bodies using the count of the mites found in the sample to gauge how many mites are in the hive's population of bees. As indicated on the previous slide, it needs to be said that there's a popular alternative to the alcohol wash called the sugar shake method. Like the alcohol wash, bees are added to a container, but instead of holding isopropyl alcohol in the test device, the jar contains store-bought powdered sugar. The premise here is the finely ground sugar interferes with the mite's ability to hold on to the bee, and you get the added benefit of not killing the sample bees. While it might be conceptually similar to the alcohol wash, and it has the added benefit of not killing the test bees, it has been demonstrated through research that this method is inferior for dislodging the mites and results in inaccurate counts. It is also, in practice, difficult to execute when certain atmospheric conditions are in play. There's more to this subject, but for brevity, we're simply going to move on and recommend that you go to the alcohol wash. Just saying this one more time, our recommendation for the program is that you go with the standard. We are advocating that you go with the alcohol wash method for the greater good of your colony. Not in the habit of doing editorial, but in a short order editorial. One reason for this is we have prioritized in the program colony survival, and as such, we will take the path that's going to have the higher chances of success for you and protect your investment. In a moment, we're going to walk through a step-by-step process description, but before going there, a quick word about the fluid to be used. It's called an alcohol wash because traditionally isopropyl alcohol is the fluid of choice. That fluid, liquid, is not very nice to work with. It smells, it can be harsh on your hands and on your skin if you get it on there. In time, beekeepers have successfully experimented with other less harsh chemicals. One of the more popular ones being windshield washer cleaner fluid for your car. Now, what you choose is personal preference. You can go the traditional way, or you can switch out to some of the alternatives. Before we get into the detailed process, let's just do a quick overview of it. You're going to prep your kit. You'll make conventional entry into your beehive and select a frame of bees to sample, knocking the bees off, workers please, into your sample container. You're going to scoop up a half cup of the sample bees and place them into your test device. Vigorously shake them in the fluid to dislodge any of the mites on the bees, and then swirl the contents down into the bottom of the container to wash the mites from the mass, and finally you're going to count and calculate. Holistically, that's the process in a nutshell. But there are a few important instructions for some of the steps. One of them, for example, is to make sure that you do not get your queen in the sample. So let's spend a moment going over some of the additional details in the step-by-step process. We said the first step was to prepare your kit. Let's go through what exactly is in a kit just to make sure that there's no misses here. If you've not done it yet, make a task to provision your monitoring kit by getting a tub, typically a Rubbermaid one like the one shown here that you can find in a Walmart or a Target or your local grocery store works perfectly fine. A half cup measuring, don't go to your kitchen and steal one, buy one dedicated for your kit. We recommend the Vito Pharma brand Easy Check device. As the standard in the industry, this is available in all of the beekeeping catalogs. And of course, we just spoke about your solution of choice, whether it's isopropyl alcohol, windshield washer fluid, or some other substrate. With kit in place, the next important step is choosing the right bees to sample. Conventionally, the objective here is to pull a sample of bees that should have mites on them. If we think about this while factoring mite biology, the mites are on worker bees and they want to enter into larva cells. For reproduction, they'll be hovering over the cells that are soon to be capped. Logically, this means that we will choose a brood frame that fits that profile when selecting worker bees to sample. When you choose a brood frame, you have a lot of different options to choose from, and picking the right frame requires some consideration. For example, this one is not a good choice on examination. What we're looking at here is bees emerging from the center out. Yes, this is a brood frame, but it's past its prime for selection when it comes to mite monitoring. Now it stands to reason then that this one is also a no-go, as it's all capped brood. And that disqualifies it for choice. Yes, these are likely nurse bees on the frame, but they're not hovering over larvae that's just about to be capped, so don't pick one of these. Now this one is an interesting consideration. If you look at it, you can see that the bees have all been shaken off the frame for this photo to make it easier to see what was underneath. There is brood in all stages, but on the whole, the collection of large, mature larvae is somewhat small. In a few days, this one might be ideal, but sometimes you need to look through the brood nest to see if there's a better alternative. In the case of this inspection, this was the frame with a full, large swath of older larvae, and all the cells circled were going to be capped momentarily. Incidentally, the bees were blown on just before this picture was taken, ever so gently to encourage them to move away in order for me to confirm what was underneath. Some say you can't blow on bees. I do it all the time. Now, obviously, I'm wearing a veil, so I'm not concerned, because every once in a while a bee might hop off and come to your face, but in general, just a light little puff moves them out of the way. In the end, this was the frame chosen for the sample after it was checked and found not to have the queen on it. Okay, enough background talk. Let's walk the walk. We're going to step through a bunch of photos that show exactly how to do an alcohol wash. It begins with prepping your kit. And one thing has to be said out loud. If you are monitoring several hives in succession, do not forget to empty the cup of any found Varroa mites from the previous sample before you start. It is something that's easily overlooked. Smoke your hive, work your way into the brood nest, and select your frame using the concepts just reviewed. When you find that frame, take the inner cover, place it over top of the box, and spend a moment looking for the queen. If you do happen to find her, you could put that frame aside, put it on a hanger, put it in the box in the slot by itself, and now that you know the queen is on that frame, you could freely go pick another brood frame to sample, and you know you won't have the queen in it. Do not take that frame and put it in next to all the other ones so that the queen can hop off and then she ends up in your sample. Put her away for safekeeping. Now, coming back to this notion, if it's not evident, looking for the queen, do not get the queen into your sample. You have our permission to spend a few moments' time being extra careful to look for the queen. Since you're new at it, it's going to be something that might be a bit challenging at first. One recommendation that we have is when you pull the frame out, as soon as you do, scan the outer perimeter of the frame. Typically, if the queen is in the outer margins, she'll look to go over the top bar to the other side or around. And then work your way in a circular motion down through the middle of the frame. She typically doesn't get past you as you scan that area. If you don't find the queen, then relax your eyes and come back to a full view of the frame, and sometimes because she's different, the way she moves, the way she stands on the comb, you'll be able to go, there she is, right? If you found this frame and it's the one you're interested in sampling, take your inner cover and put it over the colony like we said, and take an extra pause to inspect for the queen. Now sometimes you're going to find yourself in a conundrum. You will find the frame that you want, but there are simply so many bees that you might lack the confidence in knowing if there's a queen on the frame. This is a tip told to me by a state apiarist once. Take the frame over the brood box and give it a light shake. This will dislodge any excess bees not clinging to the comb and lessen the population on the frame. This results in a manageable amount of bees to inspect for the queen. You might ask, what if the queen is on the frame? Isn't that a risk? The short answer is the queen is always in direct contact with the honeycomb, and even if you shake the frame gently, it's a minuscule risk that she will fall off, and if she did, she fell down into the hive. Continue your look for the queen, and when you're good that she's not there, you can carry on. To move the bees to the collection container, you can shake them down, or you can do what's shown here, which is a technique to dislodge the bees. By clearing the end bar and wrapping the frame with a balled up fist while holding the frame securely with the other hand, the quick wrap to the frame will dislodge the bees into the container. Temporarily place the frame aside in a safe place while you carry on. Having your half cup measure ready, inspect the bees one more time for the queen. The bees will be flat on the bottom of the collection tub, and visually it's a good last chance to peek in the mix of bees to see if the queen somehow made it into the sample. It is said that this momentary pause will often let some of the forager bees that were on the comb jump off and fly back to the hive, leaving a greater mix of the target nurse bees to sample. Now you simply scoop up a half cup of bees, turn them over into the sampling container, and put the lid on. As the slide notes, a half cup measure is approximately 300 bees. That is the standard quantity of bees to sample for the threshold calculation in this alcohol wash approach. Now one thing to note is that you're really looking to get the ratio of mites to 100 bees. What researchers found is that when you sampled only 100 bees, the overall counts were somehow askew, and they eventually landed that to get a proper representation, sampling 300 bees was the way to go, and then they divided that by 3 to figure out how many mites were on 100 bees. It's a bit of a background detail that's not overly important, but it does serve to explain the mite ratio formula that we will cover at the end of this process. So I included it here in order for you to have some of the rationale that led to the design of this process. Coming back to where we are, secure the cover, give a quick shake, and set the container aside momentarily. We recommend at this point that you take a moment to reset the hive. Pull the inner cover off the hive if you put it there. Replace the frame that you used for sampling, and return the unused bees from the tub back into the hive. Close up the hive using smoke as you need to until it is fully back together. Now turning your attention back to the sample, you're going to shake the container like you're shaking a cocktail. Do make sure that you got the lid closed tight, otherwise liquid leaks out and gets all over you. You're going to shake it with extreme force. The goal here is to have the confidence that the agitation from the shaking will dislodge any of the Varroa mites from a bee's body. Trust us when we say that they have a massive grip on the bees, especially if they're in between the plates underneath on the abdomen. Now, agitation within the container, along with the properties of the liquid chosen, will serve to free whatever grasp the mite had on the host bee if you really get jiggy with shaking that container. You should really shake the container for a full minute or two until you are confident that there is no way that a mite could still not have been dislodged from the bees. When you're satisfied that you've done a good job, you take the container and swirl the liquids around in a motion that would rinse the bees off and intersperse any freed mites into the solution so that they fall through the built-in filter to the bottom of the sampling container. Then it's simply a matter of tipping the container up and counting the mites. The formula for deriving the percentage of infestation is to take the number of mites found and divide it by 3, and that is going to give you your percentage. Okay, now we have a number of the percentage of infestation to consider. What is done with this number? In short, if you are over 2 to 3%, the conventional recommendation is to treat. As to the 2 to 3% metric, why that number? Well, there could be a whole presentation on the backstory of this. I will share that since we've been keeping bees in our apiary from 2008, this percentage number has reduced over time. Originally, if I remember correctly, it was somewhere around 5% or higher back then. As the slide says, the researchers and the industry have seen declines in honeybee colony health if the percentages were left that high, and in time the ratios have decreased to compensate. There are also other factors to consider, which we will talk about on the next slide. But as a rule, we say to follow the gold standard and adhere to the threshold percentages articulated by the Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa Management Guide. That too will be expanded upon by the end of this lesson. Now, coming to percentage ranges, variances, mite loads have to be taken into context as to what's going on with the colony population. When bees are being replaced in abundance, the impact of the Varroa is not as detrimental. When, however, you are trying to maintain bees that overwinter in the summer and fall, having higher thresholds means more bees will be sick going into winter due to mite exposure. This is where the Health Coalition has factored in colony health and population and makes recommendations as to what percentage to hold to at specific times and conditions. Now, some beekeepers simply pick the lowest threshold, say 2%, and stay with that, foregoing to do math, and, honestly, we're not adverse to that concept. There's an unanswered question that longs for a response. Why not simply treat? The answer centers on resistance. Eventually, it will benefit all beekeepers if we could find some equilibrium between varroa mites and honeybees. There are arguments that we should have let the bees work it out with dealing with varroa mites when they first got here, but it's generally agreed, especially from the commercial perspective, that this would have been catastrophic to the beekeeping industry. It is, by and large, established that treating proactively is not a desirable way to go, for the same reason that we humans should not automatically take antibiotics every time we get a cold. Striking a balance and coming back to what was shared previously, it is better to monitor and be informed, treat when necessary, not forgetting an important aspect to monitor the post-treatments to ensure that the treatment applied was effective. To be clear, this is not a decision made from the program oversight design. It's an adoption of best practices in the beekeeping industry. We have adopted what is the norm in conventional beekeeping. Monitor, treat if necessary, and then monitor to gauge effectiveness. There are a ton of important notes embedded in this presentation, but this is a pivotal concept to understand above all. It has to do with what beekeepers might consider our perfect storm. It comes when the bee colony populations decline at the end of spring nectar flow, and when varroa mites are achieving high populations, along with drones declining and mites transferring to worker bees. This means we need to be extra vigilant for monitoring in May, June, July, and August to cover the beginning of bee population decline, mite population peak, along with mite transference. It doesn't show in the diagram on the slide that there's also a concern in the fall. Colonies that are not cared for in your neighborhood end up with high mite loads. And these mites are carried out into the world for your healthy bees to encounter. This means that you also have to monitor for mites late in the summer and fall to ensure that the passing of mites from colony to colony does not take down your otherwise healthy bees. The focus on fall oversight from the last slide comes back to winter bees. Winter bees simply cannot be sick. There are dynamics in the winter cluster behind the scenes that are too detailed to go into now, but there's one secondary lesson here, and it is colony survival hinges on healthy bees for overwintering. It is plausible to go into winter with bees that have large populations and more than enough resources, only to see them dwindle and die between New Year's and the spring. They do not visually look compromised, but because of mite impacts, they were already doomed to die. To monitor and treat when warranted is to keep bees alive. If you hear new beekeepers struggling, these concepts over the last couple slides is what they're missing and why most colonies perish, and beekeepers simply don't understand why. As we come to the end of this lesson, there is the consideration of how frequently should one monitor for mites. Conventional practice would be to monitor on a monthly basis. In practice, we hardly know any beekeepers who adhere to this mantra. It seems it is simply an impractical burden, and we observe that barely anyone shows that amount of rigor. Recognizing reality, we would offer this guidance. Given we've introduced you to the background on mite population dynamics, the logical thing to adopt would be to monitor when risks are rising. Also to monitor post-treatments to gauge effectiveness. And in those windows where the mites are impactful to the colony, namely when bees are building winter bees that need to be healthy to get through harsh conditions that span over a period of months. To understand Varroa mites is to know beekeeping in these times. Few do a better job at organizing an approach for hobbyist and commercial beekeepers than the Honeybee Health Coalition. At this website, you will find Varroa management guides that provide a decision tool for management practices and choosing treatments, along with other resources. We are truly fortunate to have such a resource at our disposal. We highly recommend you go visit that website and get a little more informed in this topic beyond what we've told you here today. In closing, one thing to say about monitoring is it's recognized that there are so many things that were left out of this lesson. If you have questions about things not covered, bring them to the online sessions. We can cover any curiosities that you have and would appreciate the ability to answer anything that is perplexing you and you really need to have an answer, things that got left off for the purpose of trying to keep this lesson focused to the standard norms for monitoring. To finish this 3-part mini-series on Varroa mites, we're going to turn to Varroa mite treatment options next. We'll cover the products available for use, some of the recommendations on how to proceed, along with some concepts of how many times to treat a year. Now there's one other pest of the hive for summer that we need to speak about, small hive beetles. We'll have a lesson on that. And we'll follow up all of this with a forecast of management tasks to take you through the summer. If you have questions, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.